Hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to the latest Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies workshop. This one is really exciting. It's on backcasting, scenario-based planning, and climate assemblies. I say it's particularly exciting because it's probably the first time that we as a network are looking at a technique or a set of techniques which are used within climate governance, but which have been rarely used within the climate assembly format. That we talk about a couple of examples where they have been used, but they certainly haven't been exploited to the full extent. I'm really pleased that we're moving in this direction to look at these kinds of interfaces. Today I'll be joined by Stina Scott from the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies, who's been organising this along with Tom, who will be appearing in a little bit, and also Nana from Knoca, who's also been providing some support. So thanks to those. As you'll have seen, we're recording the workshop, at least the bits where we're in plenary. We're going to have some breakout groups, as Stina will explain in a second. Those won't be recorded. So if you're not happy about having your face online at various points, then you might want to turn your camera off. At any point, please make comments in the chat and we'll try and pick those up. But for the time being, I'm going to pass over to Stina, who will explain what we're doing today and how we're going to do it. Stina, all yours.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stina. I'm a part of the convener team for Knoca, and I'm so pleased to see you all today. And today we are going to have a short introduction to backcasting by Tom van der Born, and after that, Graham will try and perspective that into the process of doing climate assemblies. And then we will have a plenum discussion by Tom van der Born again and Richard Blume, who both are representing backcasting specialists. And we also have Sophie and Kelly representing specialists from the climate assembly processes. And after that discussion, we are going to have two breakout sessions or two different breakout rooms, the same session, but moderated by two pairs of our panelist teams. And in these discussions, we hope that you will all participate with all your experiences and views on how to use backcasting or questions about using backcasting into the climate processes or vice versa. And then afterwards, we will pick up on the discussions and Graham will fix it all. Like, so serve a nice conclusion on how we can move forward from here. So thank you very much for joining, and please all you can rename yourself if you didn't do it already by pushing your picture. There's 3 dots in the corner, then you can rename yourself, and please do that so we know who you are. And also, if you are representing some organization, you're also very welcome to post that as well. But Graham, please take the floor. And
Great. So we're going to have, as Stina said, we're going to have a couple of quick presentations. One which will be myself reflecting a little bit on what we've done, what we've seen within climate assemblies, and what some of the challenges might be. But first off, we've got Tom van der Born, who was one of the designers of this workshop with Stina. And Tom is a climate change adaptation researcher and consultant. And he's going to give us a short introduction into backcasting and scenario planning methods, just to make sure we all have a similar kind of vocabulary and understanding as we go into the workshop. So, Tom, can I pass over to you?
Yes, you can. So Thank you for introducing me. I will share my screen. So can everybody see my
Yes.
presentation? Okay, so it's the front page. So, okay. As Graham already told, I'm going to give a quick summary of what is backcasting, especially the application of backcasting and scenario planning for climate adaptation. So to kick off, ever since humankind, man has always been fascinated by what the future will bring us. So in this sense, in doing so, we explore the knowns and the unknowns of our situation. And when we talk about the knowns and the unknowns, those refer to the things we are aware of and understand. And a practical real life example is, of course, the weather forecast. So it's about we have an idea of what will bring us tomorrow in terms of the weather. However, by exploring the future, we also run into the unknowns. By doing so, we enter the realm of the things we are neither aware of or nor understand. So if we look at the scientific field of future exploration, so which is often referred to the future studies approaches, one can distinguish different types of future study approaches for exploring the future. So as you can see in this figure, one type refers to the forecasting approaches, which focus mostly on most likely futures. So it's all about predicting most likely futures. In addition to that, we also have the other type of the more exploratory foresight approaches, including scenarios. And the focus here is more on exploring possible futures. So then the other type refers to the normative foresight approaches, including visioning and backcasting. And it's not about what is most likely to occur, neither what are possible futures, but it's more on desirable or undesirable futures. So it's actually more about the kind of futures we wish or do not wish for ourselves. So one practical example within the context of climate adaptation, we see at a global scale, we see countries, but also cities putting much effort in becoming climate resilient by 2050. So if we put these three types of approaches into a time perspective, we can say something about the suitabilities of these approaches, depending on the chosen time horizon. So, for example, in the short run, forecasting approaches are suitable because in the short run, there is more certainty about the future. But if we go further into the future, so in the long run, there's more uncertainty about the future, and then approaches like scenario planning and backcasting are more appropriate in order to deal with the large uncertainty. So if we look into the scientific and the gray literature, you can see that backcasting has been widely applied to climate mitigation, but actually up to date, it's still the least applied approach for climate adaptation. So based on this literature, you can also see a wide variety in the use of backcasting approaches, but also the related frameworks. But generally, they consist of 6 steps. To give you an example, I developed a backcasting methodology which combines the strengths of backcasting itself, but also the principles of adaptive management. So as you can see, it consists of 6 steps, in which the first step is to investigate the problem situation, after which visioning, goal setting, and the backcasting analysis will take place, which also result in the development of pathways that leads to the vision. And then it comes to the actual policy implementation and the evaluation and monitoring. So to start with the visioning step. So visioning is actually is much about thinking, brainstorming about the desired future we wish for ourselves with reference to the present situation. So obviously we can see that in terms of the current energy crisis, for example, there's a need to transition towards a carbon neutral society in 2050. So the essence is actually to achieve transformative change, and visioning also targets at this transformative change by doing it radically different compared to the present practice. So visions are important because they actually visualize or describe the point on the horizon, but at the same time, scenarios can also function as kind of visions in terms of, you know, describing what I mentioned before in the previous slides, like what are alternative futures. So scenarios help us to explore and map out the key drivers for change. And I put here some figures to give an example how scenarios are used in climate change adaptation. So climate scenarios provide kind of visions, but more in the context of the key drivers for change. One can distinguish between scenarios and visions, as scenarios are generally more exploratory, while visions are actually more normative by nature, because it actually states some normative claims about the desiredness of the futures we wish for ourselves. So when it comes to visioning, it's also about thinking in a radical different way, because you target at transformative change, and it's always challenging to think the unthinkable, because, you know, there are actually no limits. Like this picture says, like an aging Barbie, which is actually another way of thinking about things. Visioning is also creating a sense of urgency, especially creating a sense of urgency for change, because you have to mobilize people, stakeholders, to share your vision. But being visionary takes also courage, as we see in daily life, but also in the personal lives. So talking about the backcasting, so the backcasting analysis is actually a backwards looking approach, while we first start with a future vision, and then we backcast this vision to the present. And by doing so, we identify the intermediate steps until the present, which eventually brings about the future vision. So this backcasting usually results in pathways, but as many roads lead to Rome, different pathways can be developed to have alternative ways to realize the desired futures. And the major advantage to develop multiple pathways is to account for uncertainty about, for example, climate change, but also to account for unexpected impacts, side effects of climate change adaptation measures. As you can see a yellow arrow, and what is interesting is that if you have multiple pathways, so alternative road paths that could lead to your future vision, it also allows you to switch from one pathway to another when conditions would compel you to do so. Another thing is what is also important to pathway development is that scenarios can help us to assess the robustness of pathways. So in the case of multiple pathways, it can be, the reality could be that unforeseen developments will take place. So you have to question, does the current pathway perform under conditions described by the scenarios? And the scenarios are actually the description of contextual developments. So if it doesn't perform, if the pathway chosen doesn't perform under certain conditions, then it would call for minor course corrections, which also really leads to rescheduling climate actions. Or one could say, well, a major course correction is needed, so that could trigger pathway switching to eventually realize the vision. So this is actually more the principles. So I would like to tell you, to talk something about a practical example in which I was involved. This is a backcasting study in which I was involved. This backcasting study was conceived to support the development of a water management strategy for the South African Brede Overberg catchment management area. And for this strategy development process, the organization has chosen for a similar backcasting approach. As you can see, although the organization didn't label it as backcasting, but there's clearly some similarity with the backcasting principles, which you can see in this figure. So the goal of the water management strategy was to provide a collective medium to long-term perspective of the desired state for the whole catchment. So this whole process was guided by these 4 research questions, and it actually resembles the principles of backcasting. So what is the current situation, and what kind of vision do we formulate in order to change the current situation? And also by asking themselves, like, how will we get there? And then followed by the actual implementation. So the vision that was developed for the whole catchment area, and it actually included 3 explicit vision statements, which refer to the quality and protection of the water resources, but also a statement on how to have equitable and more sustainable water management in the catchment. And also collaboration within the catchment management area was also envisioned as an important topic. So from vision to strategic areas, the Catchment Management Agency, they identified 3 important strategic areas where changes had to be realized. And for each of these strategic areas, a distinct pathway was developed. So in doing so, they, as I said, for each strategic area, they developed a pathway that eventually had to lead to the overall vision, quality water for all forever. So this was actually, this backcasting study was the first backcasting cycle, which was initiated in 2009. So after this backcasting study, the Catchment Management Agency continued with the followed by the actual implementation, which was completed by 2014. And now after that, the Catchment Management Agency also started with the second strategy development process. And in this way, this whole idea of catchment management development processes was would eventually lead to more sustainable water management in the catchment, but also to increase more resilient water system. So taking into account the time constraint, if you would like to learn more about how I use backcasting in my research, you can find some relevant publications on this. So thank you for your attention, and I will give the floor back to Brian.
Thank you so much, Tom. So we're going to run into a panel in a few minutes, but I just thought I would respond initially to Tom's ideas and Tom's provocations with just a couple of thoughts from someone who's coming from a climate assembly perspective. So I'm just trying to share my screen. There we go. Okay. Sorry. Here we go. Okay, so I think there's some really interesting issues for us, for those of us who are involved in climate assemblies. And I'm also very aware there are people in this meeting who actually don't necessarily know so much about climate assemblies and know more about backcasting. So I'm just using this as an opportunity to sort of raise, to introduce people to assemblies, but also raise some questions about the interactions. The first is to say that when you look at these foresight methods, there's a very much a focus on this idea of stakeholder engagement. And I think what we need to recognize is that climate assemblies are a very specific form of stakeholder engagement. So the kinds of practices that many of the scenario and backcasting practitioners use are very different from the kinds of engagement that we use within climate assemblies. So there's a really interesting question about the extent to which climate assemblies are suitable for integrating foresight methods into, and vice versa, are actually climate assemblies within foresight processes. So for those of you who are not so familiar with climate assemblies, here's my sort of 2-minute explanation about what a climate assembly is. So firstly, they're generally commissioned by public authorities. So in the same way that most backcasting and scenario processes are commissioned by public authorities, we have a shared background there. The remit of assemblies, the questions they're asked, tend to be quite comprehensive in terms of how do we achieve climate neutrality, or how do we make a particular area more climate sensitive, rather than being policy specific, although we are starting to see more assemblies emerge that are more policy specific. They've tended also to be more on mitigation, although we're starting to see more move into the adaptation field. Most importantly, though, as a form of stakeholder engagement, their key stakeholders are everyday citizens, and they are recruited through a process of random selection, use of a civic lottery. Usually thousands of letters sent out saying, would you be interested in participating? People send, those who are interested send their responses, and then a stratified sample of those respondents are invited to participate in the assembly itself. So this means that it looks like the broader population in terms of gender, in terms of age, in terms of other characteristics that are applied. So it's a very specific sort of group that is the focus of assembly. Other actors like technical experts, interest groups, and people with lived experience provide witness presentations to those citizens through which they can learn, or on which they can deliver, and through that learning go on to deliberate. And that deliberation is supported by trained facilitators. And out of this climate assembly process, a number of collective recommendations emerge. And they have had varying degrees and forms of impact. We can see some, like the Irish Citizens Assembly that looked at climate, had quite a profound effect on the plan. We've seen some impact in France and in other nations. We've also seen other forms of impact in terms of on public discourse as well. But what I'm trying to really get across is that extent to which it is a very particular form of stakeholder engagement. And just for those who are unaware, there's been a number of national assemblies across Europe. Usually these assemblies have been quite significant in their size. We talk about 100, 150 people over a number of weekends, often up to 6 or 7 weekends in some cases. And we've even seen a global assembly emerge as well. And there's also happening a lot at local level with some of the local practices that Knoca has captured. So given that form of stakeholder engagement, given that form of assembly, an assembly that is based on everyday people who initially have little experience of this area, learn about it, deliberate, and come to recommendations. We have seen some use of scenarios. We have seen scenarios that have been used to extend participants' imagination of possible futures. And Kelly from TPX Impact, who was one of the facilitators of the Scottish Climate Assembly, will be talking on the panel in a second about her experience. We were also seeing it used in Climate Assembly UK, where it was the way in which they presented different policy options to the citizens. So as the citizens were deliberating about particular areas, they were given 3 scenarios, and within those scenarios, a range of policy options that fitted that scenario. And then when they came to make their decisions about their recommendations, members actually chose between the scenarios and between the policies within that scenario. And I've got a feeling that that might also resonate with some of the work that Sophie has done, and she's from Res Publica, who will be joining us again in a few minutes. What's important about these scenarios, though, they've been developed prior to the assemblies by the organisers and by technical experts. And I think one of the interesting things that Tom was talking about was about how stakeholders are engaged in the visioning process, in building those scenarios, and also in the backcasting process. So I have a number of questions, and I hope these kind of questions are the sort of questions that we'll be grappling with during the next couple of hours. The first is the extent to which climate assemblies can be a space for developing scenarios rather than I think it's actually quite difficult enough to use scenarios, and we'll be talking about that in a second, but actually to be the place where scenarios are actually developed, where a particular vision is developed, and then particular pathways to that vision are developed. And to what extent are assembly members actually able and capable, and how would they be able to do backcasting, to actually do that process of looking back from the vision to actually try and figure out what the key points and the key moments are in order that vision could be realized? How much of that is actually possible within an assembly? And is it that the assembly itself may actually be better for certain parts of scenario planning and backcasting, but not particularly necessarily for others? So given the relationship between experts and other stakeholders who provide evidence and members who develop recommendations, given that kind of division of expertise and that division of labor, which parts of scenario planning and backcasting are suitable to be done in assemblies and what needs to be done elsewhere? And I guess we can think of the reverse of that and asking those people who engage in scenario planning and in backcasting processes, how do they imagine that climate assemblies could fit within their processes, within the way that they think about developing plans and programs? So my hope is that we are going to move towards some answers towards some of these questions. And the way we're going to start doing this before we break out into into breakout groups is to talk to 4 people who are very experienced in this area. I've got a couple of people who are really experienced in assemblies, and that's Kelly McBride, who I've already mentioned, who's the deliberative democracy lead from TPX Impact. We've got Sophie Guillain, who's the managing director and partner of Res Publica. So they're coming from the sort of climate assemblies, deliberative democracy background. And Tom will be rejoining us, if you've already heard from. He's a climate change adaptation researcher and consultant. And the 4th member of the panel will be Richard Bloom, who's a senior sustainability advisor from the Natural Step. So I hope that we can bring them all into this space. Is that possible? If we can also spotlight them. I'm waiting on my technical people. Stina, Nana, is it possible to spotlight the 4 of us, or do we work in this, or do we work in the wide format?
We are spotlighting as we speak.
Okay, that's fine. I thought there was a way of doing it where just the 4 of us would go into it. Okay, so I'm going to start with Kelly and Sophie, and I've got a couple of questions about how you've used foresight tools and what has been the impact. So I'm going to start with Kelly, because I think in terms of chronology, the Scottish Climate Assembly tried to do this first. So Kelly, can you tell us a little bit about how you used foresight tools within the Scottish Assembly and what impact you think that actually had on the process? Was it helpful? Were there certain challenges or problems? So Kelly, over to you.
Certainly. So thanks, Graham, and hello, everyone. My name is Kelly McBride. I'm calling from Edinburgh in Scotland. And I'm going to share a few nuggets from Scotland's Climate Assembly, as Graham said there, which was a process that I think took some great partnership between the design team for that, which was involved in Democratic Society, where I worked at the time, the Evidence Group, and an organisation called Forum for the Future. So there's quite a few people involved in this. But through the process, we didn't, I would say, listening on to Tom's presentation, take a comprehensive backcasting or scenario planning approach, but we certainly did incorporate elements to extend participants' imagination of possible futures. And it was the first time that I'd incorporated this type of approach into a climate assembly. And actually, on reflection, I think it worked well, but it has certainly piqued an interest in trying to have conversations like we're having today to explore how they could more deeply connect. And we used the approach in a few different ways. So we used it actually in question setting, in developing the evidence and the learning journey that all of the participants went on during the process, and also in reflecting back on the ambitions of the assembly as they had presented it themselves. And to do that, we really drew on fictitious scenarios and storytelling to bring things to life. On the question setting, I'll take that first. We took the step of strategic problem orientation, to borrow from Tom's overview, which meant that when we set the question, we actually did it with the steering group. It wasn't kind of just done in a room by a small group of people. And it included presentations covering implications of the climate emergency, scale of the challenge, and interconnected issues. We went into exploring problems and challenges and did a kind of discover and define session to create problem statements, which we discussed, and then went on to develop the questions. So there was some elements of it within that, but really I think it's in the evidence and the way that the participants discussed issues where things were more interesting. During this assembly, there were more than 60 hours, I think, of learning and deliberation in the end, quite a lot of speakers, and we used scenarios and storytelling as tools to consider how change could happen. Reflecting on Tom's presentation again, we did a mix of what I think was exploratory foresight approaches, so exploring alternative futures, and that normative foresight approach, which was the feasibility of desired futures, but to a limited extent. And a scenario framework was basically developed, which was based loosely on previous work with the EU, the European Union's Innovate, with support from Forum for the Future. And that framework introduced to participants 4 quadrants, which looked quite similar to what Tom showed on that visioning slide. There was one quadrant around climate mobilisation, so looking at state emergency powers that could be used to maintain habitual climates and access to resources, another quadrant on civil provision and regulation, another quadrant on collaborative communities, and another quadrant on techno-optimism. And then for each of those different scenario quadrants, developed fictional stories were developed, and they explored what a day in the life of an ordinary person living in Scotland might look like at some point in the future between now and 2040. And then what happened was there was a series of discussions in our small group format, as you'll be familiar with if you know Assemblies, using a range of prompt questions and templates for participants to start exploring and thinking about the levers for and barriers to achieving change in the context of the climate crisis. And that included thinking across different levels of change, so actions for individuals, households, communities, organisations, public policy regulation, and others. So in the sessions, what we really wanted people to do was think about those different options, those versions of the future, what they didn't like, the role of the different actors, actions that could be taken, and conditions that help to drive or enable change. And someone called Anna Burney from Forum for the Future introduced a segment to try and get participants to think about how effective change could happen. So there was also some of that kind of thinking about effective change and systems change. And we had a presentation basically on how effective change could be perceived, because we know that people have different thoughts about what change means. And Anna actually went outside of climate change as a topic to try and support people to understand what change could mean by showing a video that explored rock and roll, the movement of rock and roll through the lens of system change. So the reason for doing things like that were that we were very, very conscious, and this comes to a challenge, that this kind of way of thinking and this kind of looking at scenarios and visions of the future for many of our participants was quite new and a different way of coming together to have conversations. And for some people, it didn't feel naturally comfortable to be thinking about the future in this way immediately. So supporting people to kind of like gently ease into doing that felt important, and using a whole range of facilitation techniques and prompt questions to support the group to connect and reflect on what was being presented was critical. And then the final way that I think we used some of this methodology was we created a video and a fictitious story later in the process to reflect back the goals and the recommendations that the Assembly themselves had come up with that could shape our lives by 2025, which really was a reflection of the kind of future the members of Scotland's Climate Assembly were hoping for through the recommendations they collectively developed. And again, that was another tool for reflection. I think it was quite interesting, and I'm going to share a link to the YouTube video for that. But yeah, just final reflections on impact and challenges, and I know we'll discuss more. Just thinking back to Tom's backcasting adaptive management technology, I think that's how you framed it on the slide. I think in Assemblies, we're doing okay in steps 1 to 3, which was around kind of strategic problem orientation and a bit of visioning and a bit of goal setting. But where I think we're not doing quite so well and it becomes more challenging is certainly in those steps 4, 5, and 6. I remember one of those was the backcasting analysis and pathway development. One of them was around monitoring and innovation, and I know there was another one that's I can't bring to mind. So I think we can develop scenarios, and I think we can do backcasting, but we just need to be really thoughtful about the information and support within the process to be able to do that. And just bearing in mind that, you know, my understanding of those approaches requires quite a level of interpretation of data. And we're always limited in these processes. We're always time limited in particular. So yeah, I think it would require a change to the way that we do climate assemblies and thinking about the structure to some extent, but I see a lot of opportunity and possibility. And I'm just really conscious that we just want to be careful as we approach this, that we're not introducing visions and scenarios as part of evidence in a way that limits ambition, or stuff is being presented as the only or preferred options. That we're conscious of subjectivity that can come with this, and, like, you know, who has been involved in creating scenarios that we bring to a place. But if we want to do it within the assemblies, making sure we have the time and the support to ease into doing the process is something that needs some careful thinking. So I'll say that's my opener.
Ellie, thank you. That was really interesting. And I don't know if you can share. You said you can share a link to the video of the participants, but do you also have the video, a link to the videos that that Forum for the Future created for you, which you used. I don't know if you could, I think it'd be interesting to share that with people. Sophie, I know you've used, I believe it's in the Grenoble assembly. You've actually gone one step further, as I understand it, from what Kelly's been doing. And I just wonder if you want to just briefly explain what you've been doing and some of the, I guess, some of the strengths of what you've been doing and some of the challenges that you faced it, because I know it's not always been easy. So Sophie, over to you.
Yeah, my first challenge today is to check. After hearing from Tom and Kelly, I'm not exactly sure if we did backcasting, if we did foresighting, if we did forecasting, but you'll tell me afterward. I'm just going to tell you what we did, what path we went through. So I was involved, first of all, in the design and the facilitation of the French Citizen Climate Assembly. And from that experience in which we did foresighting and in which we asked the citizen to draw their vision of a low carbon society, we just realized that this vision was very difficult then to be achieved through the proposals. So when we arrived at a local level and with less time, with less means and less a lot of very short time, we needed and I'm going to tell you first why we did imagine another way of asking the citizen to design and draw their proposals. We needed to make it easier to understand the concept of the trajectory toward neutrality and the path to carbon neutrality. This was just a concept to be introduced into the discussion. We also needed to find a way to ensure this better match between the citizens' proposals and the desirable visions that they could have. We also needed to help them to touch and understand the need of a great individual changes and collective changes, make the difference between those two dimensions. We were also seeking a way to reinforce the collective learning and save time doing it. So show them the trajectory, work on the trajectory, and the idea of backcasting and forecasting does help to build a group, does help to build this common vision of a society and then a common vision of the proposals. But first, also, at the time we were designing the convention, the local Grenoble convention, the National Agency for Ecological Transition had published reference pathways to take France to carbon neutrality by 2050. And so instead of asking, we were with this difficulty from the experience of the National Convention, instead of asking the citizens to foresight the desirable vision of a zero carbon society and then to draw their proposal, we use those pathways. They are translated in English. I'm going to put it in the discussion so you can see what we use as a scenario-based reflection. And then let me as well show you. Do you see my screen? Do you see?
Yes.
Okay. And what is the different steps we use to forecast and backcast or whatever it is called? First things that we did on the second, maybe can you see it now? On the first step, and it was the second session, we did present the possible pathways toward neutrality by 2050 that were drawn by this national agency. And we used this base to help understand what is prospective, what is a trajectory, what a trajectory can be towards neutrality, and what kind of choices had to be made to reach neutrality. So it was a base for the discussion. And what we first asked to the citizen was to reflect on the condition of success of each of those pathways. And we asked them to tell us what the condition of success could be, but also what were their points of vigilance for each of those trajectories in the territory of Grenoble. So by doing so, they understood the issues of sobriety, of efficiency, of the impact of changing individual behavior and collective behavior, thinking of new ways of governance, of planification. So they did reflect on this, and it was a first step. The second step after this work was to develop their own vision. And they could inspire themselves from the pathways or not. And we just told them that they had just arrived in 2050 on the territory of the metropole of Grenoble, and that this metropole had managed to achieve a carbon neutrality trajectory. And they could choose, the citizen could choose photos to illustrate and answer 3 questions. Instead of asking them, what would be your vision? We also try to make it more concrete, asking them, what could you do here in Grenoble by 2050? What you can no longer do? And what will you do again in 2050 that you are not doing in 2022? So then they wrote their global vision. So that was the step 2. Step 3, what we did was asking them to deepen their long-term vision, but by thematics. We explored different levels to achieve carbon neutrality through housing, mobility, agriculture, economy. And for each of those subjects, they choose priorities and elaborated actions. And then they wrote again a long-term vision to each thematic. And they reviewed their own global vision. So what we always had to do was doing back and forth from the vision to the proposals. And then what we did in the 4th session was again to come back and analyze the proposals and check that it was okay with the vision they had written at the beginning. In the last session as well, for 5th step, they did vote and their long-term vision for each thematic, and then they voted as well the proposals. I think the more complicated thing maybe here, so I'm not sure about it. I think this was backcasting, and this first step was forecasting or foresighting. I'm not sure about it, but I would say that what helped in our way of thinking this projection and work was to use existing resources, saying that it was just indicative, that they could use it, they could reflect on it first before thinking about their own first vision and then second their own proposal. But it was a way of working with grouping of action adapted to the territories with the local authorities. So on the second step here, when they deepened their vision, they could check on what could be the possible actions. So on the Tom proposal, what we did was proposing them some action. They could situate them on the pathway, and if they had other ideas, they could put them also on the timeline. I think I could say a lot of other thing, but the principal difficulty is that of the match between proposals and vision. So that's what we worked on by proposing action, proposing pathways, and showing the citizen what could be the possibilities and asking them to reflect on it.
Thanks, Sophie. So can I just ask you quickly what can you just expand a little bit about what you found most challenging in trying to do this?
That was trying to have a real match on and the evaluation of the impact of the different actions that the citizens could propose. So what the answer we thought could be possible to that was to work on actions once they had defined their vision on the first, it was the second session, once they had defined this vision, we worked with the local authorities and said, okay, that's what they are thinking. We have the different actions existing and proposed on the pathways of the national agency pathways. So what can we retain as action useful to reach the vision that the citizens are proposing? So we listed by different thematics, we listed possibilities of levers and actions. And then in the third session, we showed them those actions, and we asked them to position them on the pathways that they had. We told them, okay, that if you are having these pathways, if you are having this vision, here are the possibilities that you can use. And then talk about these actions and check if, since they are very engaging, they do need the impulse, or they need to be put in action with a lot of changes in the society, collective or individual. Do you really confirm your vision? And if yes, and if those actions that are proposed to you can be a way to resolve the situation, then tell us what are the conditions of success of these actions. So we didn't ask, what is the solution? What are the proposals? We did ask, here are some solutions. What is your solutions? What do you have to say about this solution? And then here are some proposals. What do you have to say on those proposals? And what other proposals would you do? So the conditions of success and the condition and the risks that you could see for the society were very interesting to address. Instead of addressing the what would you do, it would be in what conditions could you do that to reach your vision. I'm not sure I'm clear about everything, but that's
really helpful. So Richard, I'm going to turn to you. You've just kind of like seen Kelly and Sophie have been at the forefront of trying to use something like the kind of scenarios and backcasting that you're interested in. I'm kind of interested in your reaction to what they've been saying, and also whether you, having been introduced to the sort of citizen assembly model of the particular type of engagement that it entails, how you see that this could be useful, or whether you see there could be various problems with using this particular participatory approach. So Richard, what are your thoughts?
It's a bit hard to know where to start, actually. It's there's a lot of very fascinating things going on, and that's so great to see. You know, I think any sort of process that's getting people to step outside their comfort zone and step into the future, regardless of exactly how the model and how it's done, I think is valuable. I wanted to just, we at the Natural Step work with backcasting all the time, and we work with a specific version of backcasting, which is about backcasting from sustainability principles. So we have our own sort of subversion of how to apply backcasting. And I think that's relevant, of course, to climate, but it's relevant to wider sustainability topics as well. And what, in my experience, I've worked with backcasting in organizations, and I think the same issues apply there, where you're trying to get something that's representative. You don't want to sort of stack the cards in a certain way. You want to try and get almost a diagonal slice of an organization, or even a value chain, or if it's a municipality or any type of constellation. I think you want to try and get that representation of the system. If we're trying to change a system, we have to have that representation. So I see that's sort of a parallel. I'm also thinking then about like the challenges of getting, because I don't know exactly the techniques you use to build this common understanding in the citizens assembly model, but I think that's one of the big challenges with backcasting, is getting people to align on a picture of the future. If we don't, if you've got a group of people, you're likely to have a group of ideas, and then how do you get people to come to this sort of consensus on the future? So I think both the idea of backcasting itself is helping people to get comfortable with stepping into the future. The process of backcasting is about knowing that you're going to step outside your comfort zone and think long term, and think beyond the realm of what's possible, like back to what was said at the very beginning about the long term and the uncertainty. And I think just explaining the concepts around backcasting as a theory is also quite useful in getting people to be comfortable with stepping into the unknown. Thinking of other thoughts that popped into my head as we were going through there. Yeah, I mean, just about how to build this shared understanding. Our perspective on this is always to sort of start with some sort of mapping or some sort of analysis to get this shared problem, understanding of the problem, but also then where we need to aim. Trying to think what else has popped into my head. I don't know if there's any particular questions that if you want to steer me in a direction now.
No, I was looking for some immediate responses, Richard. I mean, it'd be interesting to get Kelly and Sophie to respond on that issue of trying to build a collective vision, because my sense is that assemblies are pretty good at getting kind of high level visions, but actually when you come down to the details, there are quite strong differences about how that vision is to be realized, and that can be quite challenging.
Can I share my screen for half a second? So, I mean, just to put it also into context here, I think this is what I was trying to get to when we work with sustainability. The natural steps background is to come from consensus around root causes of unsustainability, and then a set of scientific principles have been defined. So what we actually do in our process is first help people get familiar with, you can forget all the complexity about all these different issues that are wrong in the world today. Let's learn the rules of chess or the rules of sustainability and know what they are and define them as a set of principles. So once we do that in our backcasting process, we step into this awareness and visioning, baseline, creative solutions, and prioritization. So we actually train people in this method and say it's very clear and simple. It's as simple as anything. And I think where it starts to come to life is once everyone has got that shared idea of it's as simple as A, B, C, D, then you can go into those steps and start to look at, for example, you come up with some ideas. Now we're going to prioritize them and look at scenarios. How are we going to prioritize them? So then we go into this D step where we have a set of prioritization questions, and all the people in the process are trained in those prioritization questions. So once that's done, then you can go through and you can look at it. Is this really a step in the right direction? Is this a resilient or flexible solution that will get us all the way to the goal? And do we have the resources or the return on investment to get us to go all the way to the vision that we've come up with? So basically you could see in this model here, these little icons with the sustainability principles. Now you could just as easily work with the planetary boundaries or the donut economics model and have that shared picture of, okay, it's not just about any normative future, it's about a normative future within what the science tells us is necessary. I think there's sometimes a little bit of debate about whether the science is normative or not, but anyway, I just wanted to share that because I thought it might help explain, because I don't know where in the citizens' assembly process you would get into prioritization. But if everyone has got the same mental model on how we're going to prioritize ideas, then that can come either in the process or after the process. It can be done by the facilitators, or it can be done in between the workshop sessions. But then everyone knows that there is a shared set of criteria on how we're going to prioritize the pathways towards our goals.
Kelly, did you want to jump in at that point?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've got a couple of quick reflections. And again, I'm really excited that we're having this call because I think this is still a thing we all need to think through. So I'd say in an assembly, absolutely, you do get into prioritization and you generate ideas and you can prioritize them. What I was really interested in looking at that, Richard, was like how you get from that A to B. So looking at the backcasting, because I think it's that in-between stuff that feels quite challenging because it requires you having knowledge and maybe information about a range of different things. And I might be wrong on this, including who has the power to make changes. So what actors are you targeting changes or interventions or whatever at? Where do they need to happen? The scale at which they need to happen. And just reflecting back on my experience of assemblies, and this never seems to be answered very well, but cost always comes up. So we get into we've done this process, we've got our priorities, We've plotted them out from A to B along this timeline. We've done our backcasting. The feasibility check of that, I guess, is where my head is going. So how do we maybe get in the expertise to work alongside participants in a way that doesn't feel too directive, that gives them the space to look at that vision and understand the feasibility of options that they've set out? Because I can see a scenario where you get to the end of the process and you've done all that, and then yeah, the policymakers or the implementators and people implementing things look at it and like, nah, that's not workable. So how do we deal with that challenge? For me is something on my mind.
So Sophie, have you got anything to say about that? Because I know because there's feasibility in two ways, isn't there? There's the economic feasibility. I guess there's also the climate feasibility. Are we actually hitting the targets that we're trying to hit? And you're trying to work on quite a short, these things happen over a number of weekends, but it's a fairly short period of time to be trying to make these assessments, which are incredibly difficult. So Sophie, did you have any, because you probably tried to do the most sophisticated approach to this. How did you deal with this sort of economic and climate feasibility issues?
Well, on the national convention, we had the help of experts and even some logistic specialists, because the national convention aimed to the definition of a law. So what we always had to do in between all sessions was to verify the impact of each proposal and then go back to the citizen and work on the reflection of the experts, and then go deepen the proposal to fit the objective of the reduction of emissions. But I'm not sure I'm responding to your question. This was a particular situation, but referred to backcasting during the Grenoble's convention. We were going back and forth all during the convention between the vision and the actions. And we had, during the summer, we had this time in which the experts looked at the proposals and checked on if there were enough, or if they were reaching, and if they could reach the objective or the vision that the citizen the vision that the citizen had defined. I would say this, from the national experience to this local, I think this doesn't work. The expert, they come in and they do help in a way, but they put everything by the side. So what we are now saying to the authorities is, okay, maybe the proposals, maybe the vision will not reach the objective of neutrality, but just take it as what the citizens are ready to do and what they are thinking that could be done. So the gap that there is between what they are proposing, what they are saying, and what you are reaching is an information itself. So don't get into this specific need of always reaching the thing. But nevertheless, we do think it's important for the citizen to understand that gap. So that's why and where the backcasting helps. And what we did, so then I'm responding or addressing the other thing about prioritizing the proposal and see how they could reach also this objective. What we did was not only asking them to prioritize the action, but it was to tell us if on some actions that we were proposing to put on the timeline, do you think that at that time this action should have significantly resolve the problem moderately or not at all? It's a way of prioritizing the action. Can it be very, does it have to be very implemented at a high level at that time? Instead of saying, do that at that time, then that, we ask them to graduate the level of the intensity of the action. I'm not sure I'm explaining it well, but it's a way of not entering into the calculus of the impact, but the intensity of the implementation, and then thinking that it would be also the intensity of the impact.
And I guess you were doing that with climate. Kelly was raising initially the issue of economic feasibility, you could also be doing that with the kind of like with a budget as well. That could be done.
Well, to tell you, when we started to frame the Grenoble Convention, we wanted to do it on a budget-based proposal, but the authorities didn't reach to that proposal. So, but the idea was, okay, we have a budget of, it's not a financial budget, but it's a budget of carbon budget. So we have to reach this low carbon thing, and that would cost us not just an economical cost, but also cost in society, in organizations. So how show the citizen what would be the impact of each proposal. But the modelization of this was too complicated in the time. And again, I think our problem in the Citizen Convention is the time to approach the complexity of the subject. So what I would say is that the backcasting or the forecasting approach, by saying or by giving a frame of what could be the pathways and what could be the actions, helped us building the pathway and building the trajectory and building the proposals. Some could say that we did put into the discussion too much information and too much solutions. But when you ask doing that, when you ask the citizen always to reflect on the proposals you do, if the proposals are not real and that they show different possibilities, then I think it's a way of doing it. And it was easier to do in 5 sessions at a local level that it had been at a national level.
Thanks, Sophie. Rich, I don't know if you want to make a quick response. I'm really aware I haven't brought Tom in. I left him to last because he'd already had 15 minutes, but but Richard, was there anything you wanted to respond to on that in terms of things like the sort of challenge of trying to get experts and everyday lay citizens working together, or those kinds of or the sort of practical issues that Sophie was raising? Does anything chime with you?
Yeah, definitely. I think I mentioned it already, but I think a common language is what's needed. You've got people that are very much in their silos or specialization areas, are very knowledgeable, but may not see things outside their domain of expertise. And you've got everyone in their different areas. So creating this high level understanding and creating a shared framework for that understanding, I think helps pull people out of their drill holes. And so that's, sorry, I've got a son home from school in the background here. But I'm thinking about, so another thing that Kelly, you mentioned as well was this, I don't know if it was really about the gap between the present and the future. I just wanted to make a comment on it, that I think this idea of, again, the framework of helping people understand that the concept of backcasting is to say, what happens is that you need to create the tension between the present and the desired future, and it's uncomfortable. And what tends to happen is either people compromise on the visions or they pretend that they're better than they are to try and break that tension. So explaining to people and letting people know that's a language thing, to understand that we're gonna test ourselves, stretch between the present and the future, and it can be uncomfortable or it can change our views. So let's watch what happens in the room. As soon as we put up an ambitious goal, all the technical people are going to say it's not possible, and then all the artists might say it is possible, or they don't know if it's possible, so they're going to have to listen to the experts. And then we get into this whole thing where, do we just listen to the experts or the technical people? So explaining this idea of creative tension actually helps people have a language to discuss the idea that we don't know everything, and it is complex, and it is beyond the realm of, like Tom was saying, the unknown unknowns. So having a language to even discuss that, I think, helps. And then I'm also thinking about the timeframes. I mean, in many of the processes where we've been involved, we've seen if you build the capacity of people to think about backcasting, like they're trained in backcasting and how to think about this, then they can be ambassadors or sort of advocates for the process moving forward after goals have been set or something. So it becomes more of a living process rather than we did backcasting once and now it's over and now we've got our goals and we go back to whatever we were doing before. It's more it becomes a living process because people have been trained in the idea of backcasting.
Yeah, okay, that's really helpful. Tom, I'm really sorry I've silenced you, but do you have any I didn't do it on purpose. Do you have any thoughts on what you've heard before we have a short break and go into breakout groups? So what are the sort of themes that you think are coming out from this?
Well, just in short, so I also agree that building consensus on what is the common way to go forward. I also have some experience with that, and sometimes it can be very problematic. And you know what comes into my mind is that it also depends on the type of stakeholders you involve. But we haven't talked yet about the setting in which the backcasting exercises occurs. And you know, depending on the setting in which the backcasting exercise unfolds, it's also important to think about who is in charge of the whole backcasting exercise, because it makes a difference whether the backcasting exercise is research initiated or even government initiated. And it matters because there is, in case of a government initiated backcasting exercise, there's also some pressure on it, right, to come up with some outcomes. And in this sense, maybe a backcasting exercise is also to increase the credibility of the outcomes of the process, but also the outcomes. So actually it comes to really comes down to producing meaningful outputs, which also can account for the which can also generate stakeholder commitment for the results.
No, that makes
so
sense.
in essence, you also need to have some process arrangements which actually put some pressure on the process itself, but also to sometimes in difficult situations to force things.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big issues we have in the assembly world is these things are commissioned by government, but very often ignored by government afterwards. And this is a really interesting question about how you kind of how you integrate that kind of integrate the political actors into the process as well. I think is really critical.
So it also comes back to your question, like at what time do you actually involve stakeholders in this sense, climate assemblies? Because if the initial goal is just to inform kind of sectors or inform specific target groups, then you also adapt the whole backcasting process to it.
No, I think it's a really interesting problem that within a citizens' assembly, the priority is given to citizens. Yeah. They are informed by stakeholders, and stakeholders may be part of the governance of it as well. But actually, in most of these processes, the recommendations are created by the citizens themselves with information from other stakeholders. But those stakeholders, if you like, aren't collective owners of those recommendations, which I think can create certain types of problematic you haven't got the same level of buy-in that you might have with a much more sort of collaborative process. So I think it's a really interesting dynamic. Anyway, listen, these are exactly the questions we're going to explore over the next hour or so. The idea now is that we're going to take these into 2 breakout groups, which are going to be facilitated by a combination of one climate assembly person and one backcasting person. So we've actually got a mix in there, and we're going to be focusing on the questions of the real potential of using these foresight methods, but also the challenges that we've started to unpack here, and to think about what further work we need to do across these 2 communities to actually take this to actually really deepen practice. But I'm going to hand over to Stina, who's going to explain. Okay, hello, welcome back, everybody. That I was not trying not to involve myself too much in the conversation in the in the group I ended up in. It was really fascinating, really interesting. What I'm going to ask is somebody just we've got about 20 minutes, so we've given ourselves a decent amount of time to reflect. Usually the feedback is like 1 minute, and you've got and everyone's just trying to chuck things in. But I actually want to try and do a little bit of reflection. So let's start with the first question about the potential and challenges of integrating foresight methods within climate assemblies. So Kelly, did you want to give us a sense of what was said in your group, what the kind of where the interesting dynamics were between these two ways of thinking?
Yes, sure. So I will do my best, but of course, group, you may want to post in the chat or add anything later. So on that potential point, I mean, there is some potential, which is the good news. We can see the opportunity of introducing different scenarios to assemblies being an area of potential, and also having the opportunity to do something like explore undesirable futures as part of that. There are some reflections related to the challenge in a second, but maybe there could be something that we can do where we incorporate elements of foresight tools and practices into climate assemblies, where it's really challenging to perhaps do an entire full backcasting process. But there's certainly some nuggets and opportunities there in incorporating different elements. But then thinking about some of the challenges, and I guess this is where it gets a bit real, there's still a little bit of uncertainty about how to exactly include backcasting and knowing exactly how to use the tools. Time is tough. Imagining different visions and scenarios and pathways is already challenging work to do. So doing that in the usually limited time of the typical framework we see for a climate assembly at this point in time might be hard. So we need to think about the structure to climate assembly processes. Someone said that could mean that processes might need to take 1 year, 2 years perhaps, with informed people, giving them enough time to deal with the information, to make calculations, to kind of revisit where they've got to and actually approach things potentially iteratively. Although there's also an option, of course, to do a series of assemblies with different members at different points on a timeline. So, you know, maybe we need to be a bit more creative about how we design these processes. But we need to be conscious that we are, in some cases, also fitting with quite narrow policy goals of policymakers or commissioning authorities for these types of processes. So really, will the time that we need to do this properly and to do it really effectively and impactfully align with some of those expectations of commissioners? And then another thought is around the data that we use to create scenarios. We need to be quite conscious of the data we use, understand that in some cases it might not be complete, it could be flawed. But then again, we can also just be quite honest with assembly participants when we introduce things related to kind of the evidence and the different frameworks we're talking through. So that might not be too much of a challenge, but one to note. I think I'll say, yeah, I'll stop there for now.
Great, that's really helpful, Kelly. That's really interesting. Richard or Sophie, one of you just going to feedback some of the potentials and challenges that you explored in your group?
Yeah, so I think there was curiosity and a sense that there is potential to merge these approaches or use backcasting more. I think some of the curiosity or questions came up were more around, I mean, some of the things had already been said by Kelly now as well, but how long does it take to backcast, and the timing, and even how does it fit in with the goals of whoever's convening the process. We had a bit of discussion about being open to alternative technologies. If we don't, do we always know what the goal is? Like maybe it's beyond the limits of what we think. So then I guess that comes into the realm of experts, and we then discussed a bit about the possibility, or if it's important that the scenarios or the ideas have been pre-made, or if there is the scope to work with that. And I think maybe one of the conclusions was that it seems a little bit like there needs to be more reasoning in the backcasting processes. So I don't know if I've interpreted that correctly, but just that somehow the substance, something needs to be figured out there around that. I think that we had a little question then around the scope of the citizens' assemblies, whether the size of them is limiting their potential, whether they should be a lot, if they were bigger, more people involved, would they be having more impact and influence over the context in which they're being set up? And yeah, I don't know so if I've covered everything there, Sophie, if you wanted to reflect on anything further.
I think what Kelly reported is very close to some of the subject we addressed, maybe differently, but the time you said about, you talk about it, the link and the link with experts and the responsibility of the data we are bringing into the discussion throughout the pathways or throughout also actions, and verifying if they are reaching the goal. I think we did talk about it again. The fact we are really doing backcasting, are we really coming back and put on the timeline different options. I was talking about my experience that we are not really exactly doing that. And the fact of narrowing the thematics also was addressed. And maybe some of the people can say some of the things, I'm not sure. You did resume well.
So I didn't ask Tom, was there anything that you think hasn't been brought out from the conversation? I mean, Kelly's brilliant at summarizing, but, you know, occasionally she misses something.
Exactly. I don't have anything to add to it. It was perfectly summarized, but I think a concluding remark from my side is that the application, a combined application of backcasting and climate assemblies, that would be a novelty. So I think I also did some literature review before the workshop, of course, and actually it's it would be a new field.
No, but a lot of the stuff that's happening in citizens' assemblies is new, and that's one of the reasons the knowledge network's there, because we're desperately trying to keep up with each other and learn what we're doing. So this is actually, you know, I guess I don't know whether Richard and Sophie, did you think at all about, or anyone else from that group or any group at all, think about what it is that Knoca could do in this space? How could Knoca help take forward practice? Did you have time to think about that at all, or were you too busy trying to think about the potential and challenges? I'm looking at your faces, so it looks as though you didn't have time to think about that. That's fine. And I think the same was true in I think Kelly brought it up in the 5 minutes to go. So, okay. So yeah. I guess this is a general question. So we've got this sense that there is an interest, there's a challenge here, there is potential, but there's, you know, it's not going to be easy, and it's about what Knoca could do. There was someone in our group who was suggesting that we could run a pilot, a kind of a simulation, so that people could see how people like Richard and Tom actually do their backcasting, so that people could. I think that was Walter's idea, which was great. Matthias, have you got any thoughts?
Yeah, well, one of the things that intrigued me is that Sophie was telling that she's working with groups of 150 to 2,000 people. But most of the time, if we're doing backcasting, and the workshop I've been involved in are much smaller groups. So I think there's one of the things that we can really learn from each other, how we can take the ideas and the tools and the ABC method of Richard and scale it up to those sizes, because it would be really nice to get much more people involved in your processes.
Richard, do you want to say something?
I think maybe it's interesting timing as well now, you know, post-COVID, and everyone's in the world has maybe become a little bit more digital savvy than in the past. But I think the skills of facilitation is kind of critical to manage the group size. Either it's even if it's in a workshop setting where it's many people. Sophie, you mentioned this, that you're going to have many people. If it's 2,000 in a physical event, I assumed. So I imagine you're going to have quite a few facilitators or some very advanced techniques for harvesting ideas. And I think knowledge sharing around those tools and processes and how people are working with them, I think that's I think all sorts of facilitation networks exploring how to do this in a more effective way. And I think there's a lot to learn and share on different platforms and tools and techniques, and because that's actually what brings the processes to life, how well they're managed.
Okay, anybody else any thoughts about what Knoca as a network could do, and in terms of taking learning or practice forward in this area? Any thoughts at all? You've all been in a very long workshop and you're all kind of like dying to go and have a cup of coffee, so you can. I mean, my set on a personal note, I have a couple of thoughts about what might be useful. I mean, it was really interesting hearing Sophie and Kelly talk about their experiences to date. So I think one thing that would be useful would be for us to actually try and collate what has already been done. And I think the other thing that would be useful would be to get someone like Richard and Tom or others to actually carefully look at the structure of an assembly and say what they think could be done in that space. But, I mean, we're kind of playing about with this stuff very often as eager amateurs, whereas they've been doing this a long time. So it'd be quite interesting to kind of say, this is the constraint of our participatory process. What could you do with that? Kelly?
Yes, I feel like I should also add something came up in our group, which was a practical suggestion and maybe lends itself to maybe capturing some case studies and things. Was it's pointed out that there are just so many materials we can already use, so many examples of different scenarios that exist out there. So perhaps, and maybe it's Knoca, maybe it's somewhere else, but the creation of some kind of database that's starting to collect things to use across processes. And I know this lends itself to a wider conversation about the materials and presentations and all that stuff that we have. But it feels like some people would find that useful too. So I guess that's Knoca as a bit of a collator and disseminator.
No, absolutely. I mean, in some ways, I think that's part of that second thing about, maybe there's actually 3 steps. The step of what have we already done, what's out there that we could use, and then the sort of reflections back from the backcasting, people who are doing backcasting and saying, what else could be done, so definitely, I think that would be very interesting. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions anybody's got before we leave this space?
I have one. It's
Richard.
Maybe also just thinking about how to bring citizen assemblies into places where they're not currently, where they could add value. I don't know if any of you are involved in some of the processes in Sweden around climate neutral cities and various initiatives there. There's labs, there's processes, there's initiatives there where citizenship engagement is very much part of the agenda. So I see connecting dots as an opportunity as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Well, on that note, we will try and do some reflection on what we've learned today. Send that out to you and get your reflections on our reflections, and try and get something out there which is based on our learnings from this workshop, and then try and figure out how we might take those next steps, which I hope will involve some, if not all of you. Before we end, I'd like to thank Kelly and Sophie and Richard and Tom for being really open about their practices and sharing with us what they've done, and some of the experiences and some of the limitations in what they've done, because I think that's a really helpful start when people are actually lay their practices on the table and they're kind of willing to open them up. So that's really great. I would really like to thank Tom and Stina for actually developing this workshop. They've put a lot of thought into this, and I think it's been a really great initiative. And I think these kinds of initiatives, because most of the people in climate assemblies have come from a deliberative democracy background and are trying to learn fast about some of the climate governance things. And I think this is a really important opportunity, an example of how we can do this learning. I'd also like to thank Nana and Stina and Melda, for keeping us all in one virtual space so well. So thank you for that. And as ever, it is just such a pleasure to spend time with members of the community who are interested in these sort of open discussions about how we might move climate assembly practice forward. So once again, thank you to the organisers, thank you to the speakers, and thank you to you for participating. It's been a really interesting afternoon. Thank you, everybody. Take care.